Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone. Delighted to be here in Vancouver. My wife and my kids and I passed through here about 10 years ago on our way to Whistler, but we took a good look as we went through. Sam mentioned the New Yorker, and I was telling him today about my most recent New Yorker assignment. I had to go to South America. I was in Colombia, in Bogota. And my first day in Bogota, two women drove me in an old Toyota out to the edge of town to a sort of industrial park beyond the city limits. And there in a building that looked like a warehouse from the outside, the man I had come to interview, whose name was Miguel Caballero, shot me in the stomach with a .38 caliber revolver from about 8 inches away. I felt a sort of a thump in the gut and then nothing. Fortunately, Caballero's business is making fashionable bulletproof clothing, and I was wearing a suede jacket of his design. His customers include most of the presidents of Latin American countries, many hip-hop stars, the movie actor Steven Seagal, who has sort of a kimono that Caballero made for him. But when I left Colombia, my luggage was searched very thoroughly by the security people at the airport, and I had my bullet and the spent cartridge from my adventure in my backpack. The security agent wasn't interested in those, but he asked me to turn on my camera to prove that it was just a camera. And when I did, the image that came up on the LCD was of Caballero shooting me in the stomach, and he just waved me through. I later interviewed by telephone 2 engineers from DuPont, which makes Kevlar, which is the best known bulletproof material, which was invented by a woman who's now in her 80s, and she lives in the eastern United States. They were trying to invent a synthetic fiber to put in automobile tires. And I had a long interview with them, and they were explaining the science of Kevlar to me. And at some point in the conversation, I said, hey, am I the only person on this call who's actually been shot in one of these things? And there was a sudden, lengthy silence from these engineers who apparently at DuPont, they do not test the product on human beings, not even on journalists. And but I was very glad that I had waited till I got home to talk to these men, because I enjoyed being shot, and it was one of many interesting experiences that I've had over my career. I'll tell you a little bit about my background, my green background. My wife and I got married right out of college now 32 years ago, and we spent the first 7 years of our life together living in a utopian environmentalist community in New York State. We lived in a very small space, just 700 square feet. We didn't have a clothes dryer or a lawn or a car. We did our grocery shopping on foot. We did most of our shopping on foot. When we had to go someplace that was too far away to walk to, we took public transportation. Our electricity use was minimal. It worked out to about $1 a day. The utopian community where we lived was Manhattan, New York City. We lived in an apartment on the Upper East Side at 69th Street and 2nd Avenue. Most people, including most New Yorkers, don't think of New York City as a utopian environmentalist community. But by the most significant measures, New York is the greenest community in the United States. The average New Yorker uses just 90 gallons of gasoline a year, which is a level that the rest of the United States hasn't matched since the late 1920s, when the most widely owned car in the US was the Ford Model T. The national average in the US is about 454 gallons, which is 5 times Manhattan's average and 3 times the average for New York City as a whole. 82% of employed Manhattan residents walk to work or ride bikes or take public transit. That's 10 times the rate for the US as a whole. And Canada and the United States are very close in all these categories. They're 2 very automobile-dependent countries, as those of us who came here in cars know. And although here, I'm sure many people didn't. New York City residents use less energy in all categories than other Americans do. And the average New York City household, the electricity use during a year is about 4,700 kilowatt hours during the year, which is well below the US average. Dallas, Texas, the average household in Dallas, Texas uses about 16,000 kilowatt hours. New York City has larger population than all but 11 of the 50 United States. If it were granted statehood on its own, it would rank 51st in per capita energy use. The New Yorkers have the smallest carbon footprints of all Americans, about 7.1 metric tons of greenhouse gases per person per year, which is less than 30% of the national total. Manhattanites generate even less. They're about on a par with Sweden. In 2007, Forbes, the business magazine, picked Vermont as the greenest of the United States, which was a choice that's consistent with conventional thinking about the environment. Vermont has lots of everything that we think of as green. It has an abundance of trees and farms and backyard compost heaps. It has no big dirty cities. Burlington, the largest city, has a population of just under 40,000. It also ranks high in almost every category that Forbes considered, including the number of buildings that had received certification from LEED, the U.S. Green Building Council's rating system. And it also ranked high in the implementation of public policies to encourage energy efficiency. But Forbes's ranking was unfortunate because Vermont, in most ways, sets a very poor environmental example. It has no truly significant public transit system other than its school buses. It's one of the most heavily automobile-dependent states in the United States. The average Vermonter uses about 550 gallons of gasoline a year, which is 100 gallons over the national average. The average household in Vermont uses 7,100 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, which is about 2,500 more than the average household in New York. Vermonters, despite their backyard compost heaps, also generate more solid waste than other Americans do, and more than New Yorkers. My wife and I don't live in Vermont, but we live this life because in 1985, when our daughter was 1 year old, we decided to flee the city, and we moved about 90 miles north to a small town in northwestern Connecticut with a population of about 4,000. We moved into a house that's now about 220 years old, so we live in recycled housing. We live across a dirt road from a nature preserve, a 4,000-acre nature preserve, and we see the occasional bear taking down neighbors' bird feeders and eating them like pixie sticks. A friend of mine has a photograph of a black bear sitting in his garden like a child, just pouring birdseed into his mouth. Our electricity use rose from 4,000, we felt as though we had moved into Arcadia, we'd taken we were now living at one with nature, but in fact, our move was an environmental disaster. Our electricity use went from 4,000 kilowatt hours a year during our final year in New York in 1985 to almost 30,000 kilowatt hours, and our house doesn't even have central air conditioning. In New York City, we owned no cars for 7 years. We were very excited to buy our first car when we moved, and then almost the moment we got in there, we realized that one car wasn't enough, because when your one car is in the shop being repaired, you have no way to go pick it up. So we very quickly acquired a second car, and then a number of years later, in connection with a mild midlife crisis on my part, we acquired a third car, which then became a necessity when our kids got old enough to drive. Most people, when they picture life in the country, picture people going for long hikes and paddling kayaks and gathering chickens from their own eggs. But what you really do when you move to the country, in addition to gaining 10 pounds apiece, as my wife and I did, is you move into a car, and you move your children into car seats. The reason is that there's almost no place that we go that we can get to on foot. The nearest movie theater and the nearest large supermarket are both about 20 minutes away. When my wife and I want to see a movie, we have to wait a month and then make a 40-minute round trip. Renting a DVD, when you used to have to go to Blockbuster to do it, consumed 2 gallons of gasoline because Blockbuster was 10 miles away and every rental involved 2 round trips. When we lived in Manhattan, our pediatrician was in the lobby of our apartment building, so we could, anytime our child so much as sneezed, we could jump in the elevator and go down to the doctor. In Connecticut now, where we live, my dentist is 2 towns away, which is a 32-mile round trip by car. The key, the reason for the difference, the profound difference between the way we lived when we lived in New York and the way we live now, is density, Sam's topic, and a topic that people in Vancouver are very familiar with. Manhattan's density is about 67,000 people per square mile, which is 800 times the US average. It's 30 times Los Angeles' average. It's 1,000 times Vermont's average. If you, when we think about density, when the conventional thinking about density, people think that we create environmental problems when we move people closer together. In fact, we solve many environmental problems, and it's when we spread them out that we increase the impact of people, and not only that, but we make that impact harder to see and harder to do anything about. If you spread all 8.3 million New Yorkers across the countryside at the population density of Vermont, you would need space equal to the land area of the 6 New England states, so Vermont itself, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, Rhode Island, good, plus New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And then, of course, you'd need to find places to put all the people that you were displacing and provide them with all the redundant infrastructure of suburbia, all the roads, all the asphalt, all the shopping malls, all the utilities, all the power generation, all the waste management, all the water, all the schools, all the hospitals. Moving people closer together reduces the distance between them and also between them and their daily destinations. And it limits their opportunities for reckless consumption, as well as forcing the majority to live in the most energy efficient housing that we have, which is apartment buildings. The trend in suburbia has been in the other direction. The average size of the average house in the United States has doubled since the 1950s, since I was a child. And yet the size of the average American family has shrunk. So we now have the size of the average American household. So we now have fewer people living in vastly larger houses. And of course, when you increase the size of living space, you have to acquire possessions to fill that space with. You acquire more appliances, energy-sucking appliances. My wife and I, like most Americans, I think, set foot in our living room only to vacuum the rug and fluff up the sofa cushions. The dog uses it some. For most of our lives, despite having a very large house, we live in about as small a space as we did when we lived in Manhattan. We live in the kitchen, we live in our bedroom, and we live in our offices, both of which are in the house. One winter, I realized with horror that I had spent virtually the entire winter inside an imaginary sphere about 15 feet in diameter, because my office at that point was directly above our bedroom. And there were many days when I went from our bed up to my office, and you could have taken a 15-foot in diameter ball and encompassed both of our bed and my chair. Manhattan, furthermore, is one of the last places in the United States where walking is a primary mode of transportation. Vancouver's another. One of the key benefits of moving people and their destinations closer together is that they become less reliant on the car. New York City, the metropolitan New York City area accounts for almost a third of all the public transit passenger miles that are traveled in the United States. New York City itself contains half the subway stops in the United States. And yet it's interesting, if you open almost any recent book about public transit, modern public transit, you'll find a lot about bus systems in Brazil. You'll read about light rail in Portland, Oregon. You very seldom find more than a passing mention of New York City, even though it is really the only large-scale, fully functioning public transit system in the country. I read someplace, I can't remember, there's a single bus line that in New York City that accounts for more public transit passenger miles than I think something like the next 3 transit systems in the United States combined. New York City residents are the most carless people in the United States. New York City residents, 54% of New York City households don't own even one car. 77% of Manhattan households don't own one car. In the rest of the United States, we have 50 million more registered automobiles than we have licensed drivers. In the state of South Dakota, something like 15% of the population, 15% of the households own 5 or more cars. The main office of my magazine, New Yorker magazine, and one of my other magazines, Golf Digest, they're both owned by the same company, Condé Nast. The offices are in a building in Times Square in New York City, 4 Times Square, where I try never to set foot, and I haven't completely succeeded in that. I end up there about once a year. But the building was built in 1999. It was before LEED, but it embodied the principles of the LEED building rating system. It was built by a family foundation that was very interested in environmental issues, and it was designed with the help of Amory Lovins' Rocky Mountain Institute. It has many green features. There are photovoltaic panels in the building skin. There's a fuel cell generator on the roof of the building. There's a sort of a complicated, the skin of the building shades and insulates in an interesting, complicated way. There are, in the bathrooms, glass surfaces are made of recycled glass. There are chutes for recyclable materials inside the building that carry them to collection points inside the building. And yet, in terms of the building's true ecological impact, those features are irrelevant. Some of them are literally irrelevant, as in most big urban buildings that have photovoltaic panels. The ones on the New Yorker building don't do very much. They are said by the building's managers to provide less than 1% of the electrical consumption of the building, and less than 1% is usually a euphemism for 0%, which is, I think, what it actually is. The fuel cells on the roof provide electricity mainly at a time when the building doesn't need it, but they can't be turned off. In terms of the building's true ecological impact, the most significant facts about it are that it's a very large building and that it's in Manhattan. The building is 1.2 million square feet. It sits on 1 acre of land and goes right out to the edges. And it 6,000 people work there, and it doesn't have a parking lot. 95% of the people who work in that building come to work on foot or by public transit or by bicycle, and only a tiny number arrive by car, and when they do, they don't park there. Last year, I, like many people, was horrified by the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And there were people actually who were given literal nightmares by it. And there was a website that I saw where you could go and you could move a spill-sized blob over a Google map, and you could place it anywhere to see how big it was. And you could just about blot out the state of Virginia. The the volume of oil spilling into the Gulf was huge. It was about 56,000 barrels a day. And yet, the real environmental tragedy was not the oil that was spewing into the Gulf. It was the oil that we continued to use exactly as we intended to. That 56,000 barrels a day was equivalent to 4 minutes worth of US consumption currently. The total 87-day spill volume, which was 4.9 million barrels, the world uses every hour and a half. If the world's entire oil consumption were spilling into the ocean at the rate of the BP well, there would be 1,400 such wells spewing every second, around the clock, 365 days a year. And that's just the oil. When we talk about sustainability, I think the crucial fact that is most difficult to come to terms with is that it is not a micro phenomenon. There is no such thing as a sustainable house or a sustainable building or a sustainable appliance, for the same reason that there can be no such thing as a one-person democracy or a single-company economy. Every house, every office building, every appliance, no matter where its power comes from, no matter how many of its parts were made from soybeans, is just a small element in a huge civilization-wide network of interconnected, deeply interdependent relationships. And it's the network and not any individual component of it on which our future depends. Sustainability, in other words, is a context. It's not a technology, and it's not a gadget. We often hear people talking about technology as our salvation. The scientists will figure out what to do. About the need for a green Manhattan Project, an environmental Apollo program, something that we will put our best minds together and we'll lick our problems. One difficulty with that idea, with that hope, is that problems innovate too, and usually have better funding. The same kind of technological breakthrough that makes it possible to do more work with less fuel also makes it possible to find fuel in places where we haven't been able to find it before. Also makes it possible for us to create new fuel using machines that do things that we don't even realize that we need to do at the moment. I wrote in the New Yorker last year, I wrote a profile of a young Australian engineer named Saul Griffith, who has estimated that the world currently consumes energy at an average rate of about 16 trillion watts, or 16 terawatts, which is the equivalent of 160 100-watt light bulbs, 160 billion 100-watt light bulbs burning all the time. Capping atmospheric greenhouse gas levels at 450 parts per million, which is a level that is about 15% higher than today's, and is one that scientists often talk about as being consistent with no more than roughly a 2 degrees centigrade increase in average global temperatures. Griffith has estimated that doing that would necessitate holding global consumption, energy consumption, where it is now at that 16 trillion watts, and then replacing all but 3 of those 16 terawatts over the next 25 years with energy generated from a combination of the most promising renewable sources and non-carbon-based sources: photovoltaics, solar thermal, wind, biofuels, geothermal, and nuclear fission. And doing that, Griffith has estimated, would require building between now and 2035 the equivalent of all of the following: 100 square meters of new solar cells, 50 square meters of new solar thermal reflectors, and one Olympic swimming pool's volume of genetically engineered algae for biofuels every second for the next 25 years. One 300-foot diameter wind turbine every 5 minutes, one 100 megawatt geothermal powered steam turbine every 8 hours, and 1 3-gigawatt nuclear power plant every week for the next 25 years. Such a construction program, he has estimated, is at least theoretically achievable, but the practicalities are daunting. The design, approval, and construction of nuclear power plants in the United States typically takes decades. A new one hasn't come online since the 1990s, and there's the number of nuclear power plants in the United States is actually declining at the moment rather than rising, and after the current disaster in Japan, it's unlikely that anyone will be rushing forward to build new ones anytime soon. And yet almost any green prediction that you see for the replacement of fossil fuels relies heavily, very heavily, on nuclear power. The problem that we face is not that one group has all the facts and everyone else is deluded. As frequently happens with complex ideas, the biggest impediments to effective action are often truths rather than falsehoods. And the fiercest arguments have often been between ostensible allies. I recently wrote an article in the New Yorker about the difficulty of, essentially about the impossibility of making energy efficiency as an environmental strategy, the difficulty of capturing energy savings in the problem. A paradoxical one is that as we make our machines more efficient, we tend to use them more at the scale of the macroeconomy. The whole history of civilization is of ever-increasing efficiency in our machines, and the result of that has not been a reduction in our energy use, but rather a steady increase. Hydroelectric power, which everyone in this area is familiar with, is substantially emission-free. All of the very largest part of the renewable energy in the world that is not created by burning things comes from hydroelectric power. And yet dams destroy riparian ecosystems and human communities, and there is a very large, very active, and very vocal environmental contingent that is working to dismantle dams rather than to build new ones. And they're both right. Uranium-235 has a small carbon footprint, but what about accidents and tsunamis and terrorists and nuclear waste? American gasoline is one of the cheapest manufactured liquids in the world, even now, but taxing it more heavily would increase unemployment and deepen the recession. Both true. Photovoltaic panels and solar thermal collectors have potential as electricity resources, but installing them at utility scale also destroys ecosystems. And there are lawsuits going on right now in the United States to halt projects to build utility scale solar projects in deserts in the West. Some of the most vocal opponents of the Cape Wind project, which is a proposed wind turbine installation in Nantucket Sound, received a federal lease in 2010, but may never be built. It took a decade-long fight to get to that point, and there's no clear indication that it's actually going to happen. But some of the most vocal opponents have been environmentalists. The efficiency problem that I mentioned earlier is an interesting one. Captain James Cook sailed from England in August of 1768 on the first of the 3 voyages that made him famous. And 2 years later, he arrived in Australia. He was traveling in a wind vessel, the Endeavour, but the trip nevertheless required a huge amount of natural resources, including the lives of quite a bit of his crew. Just 56 of the 90-plus men on board the ship made it back. I traveled to Australia in 2010 on one of these completely paradoxical trips that I was going to talk about climate change. My personal share of the jet fuel consumed in that flight was roughly equal to the total energy consumed in a year by an average human being on Earth. If you want, in fact, if you're a connoisseur of big carbon footprints, check out the book tour itineraries and frequent flyer mile balances of almost any authority on the environment. But my plane, my trip then, although it used a vast amount of energy, was extraordinarily efficient. It was a miracle of efficiency because my plane was the product of decades of technological innovation. The plane carried almost 5 times as many people as the Endeavour. It required no emergency repairs en route. No one died. It made it from New York to Melbourne after less than 24 hours in motion, and it was one of hundreds of international voyages arriving in the country that day. The environmental problem with modern flying is not that our planes are wasteful. The problem is that through the steady application of engineering brilliance, we have eliminated so much waste from long-distance travel that we think nothing of it. Nowadays, the main impediment to traveling 10,000 miles for a week's trip is the less likely to be the cost of the trip, which in my case which you can fly from New York to Melbourne for as little as $600 or $700 each way, if not for free, in exchange for frequent flyer miles. It's not the cost, rather it's the perceived unpleasantness of spending a whole day sitting in a padded seat watching movies. And yet, when people talk about reducing the carbon footprint and energy footprint of air travel, we almost always focus on things like fuselages and jet engines, maybe even the design of the fuel, using computers to shorten flight paths or improve control systems. By this point, though, the total possible gains in efficiency in all those areas are very modest. The jet that I flew on is about 75% more fuel efficient than the first jets in the 1960s. And the physics of flying puts a very low ceiling on further increases, even if that weren't true. Even if the potential were great, though, the main effect of all those increases in efficiency would be to make flying even less expensive and more attractive than it is already. Flying from New York to Melbourne in 1958, which was done on a propeller aircraft, a Lockheed Super Constellation, required stops in San Francisco, Hawaii, Canton Island, Fiji, and Sydney, and it cost each passenger about something like a quarter of that year's U.S. median family income each way. That trip consumed more energy per person than my flight did, but it was greener nevertheless, because if that were the only way you could get to Australia today, you wouldn't go. The only clearly, unambiguously effective method of reducing the carbon and energy footprints of flying is to fly less, and that's something we tend not to be interested in doing. We already know how to do it. We don't need a Manhattan Project to figure it out. We just don't want to do it. And I think it's for that reason that urban density is such an important and powerful tool. It's one of the few tools that we have at hand that enables us to reduce our environmental impact in many ways without substantially necessarily reducing what we perceive to be our quality of life. And I think Vancouver is an example of that. Anybody who is familiar with downtown Vancouver is familiar with the many non-green benefits of living close to other people, close to places where there are cultural activities that take place, places that you can reach on foot, places where you don't have to drive for 20 miles in order to go to a movie. And the challenge is how we implement that and how we do it. And I've got a couple of slides that I'm going to show you that I think demonstrate one of the difficulties. I always tell people I'm on the problem committee, not on the solution committee. I don't really have any answers to any of these questions, but I wonder if we could show the first slide. This is a good slide to be showing with the sprawl meter going in the corner there. We're up to about 5 acres just since lunch. This photograph was taken in Tampa, Florida. It's a posed photograph, but it's a familiar scene to anybody who goes anywhere by car in a city. It was created by the Transit Authority in Tampa. They were making a case for building a light rail system. Now, the second slide, which John will switch to in a moment, shows all the occupants of the cars in the first slide sitting. And the reaction that you've had to that picture is the one that people always have, and even though I've seen it, I can't tell you how many hundreds of times, and I still have that same reaction to it. And when I am driving on the highway, I will often think of this slide and sort of mentally figure out how many people I'm actually looking at when I look at the sea of cars ahead of me, and it always works out to something like this. You could easily fit that group of people in the back half of a single city bus, or on in a single car of the lovely train that I took from the airport to downtown when I arrived yesterday. And just go back to the first slide, if you would, just to keep it in your mind. And now let's go to the second slide again, and I want you to look at this second slide, however, this is the difficulty. Look at the second slide, however, through the eyes of a person who was in one of the cars in the first slide. And what you see when you look at this scene, if you think the way I do, is you see nirvana. Your traffic problem has been solved. All the cars that were in your way as you were driving to work, that were holding you back, are gone. And we are pretty good at contemplating the first step, at the idea that if we build transit, we can take that many people and put them in a single train car. But we're not very good at the second step, which is realizing that if we actually succeeded in getting that many people off the road, one of the things we've done is make the road that much more appealing to people who would like to drive. And to take the next step requires something that involves an extraordinary amount of political courage and public courage and public will, which is to remove those traffic lanes, actually get rid of them, make them go away. And we haven't even been very good at the first part, but we have been very bad at the second part. So those two images are ones that bear thinking about. I think about them all the time, and I haven't figured out what to do about them. In my book, I reduced to subtitle size what I think is the challenge we face, which is that what I think is my solution to our difficulties. And that is to live smaller, live closer, and drive less. And these are really all different ways of talking about urban density. Living smaller means living in smaller spaces, as city dwellers do necessarily, because when you live in a smaller space, you not only have a smaller volume that you're heating and cooling, you also don't own as much stuff. You don't have as many refrigerators. You don't have 2 dishwashers the way a friend of mine does, so that you can put your dishes in either one. You're lucky if you have any dishwashers. My daughter believes she's is as happy as she's ever been. Both my kids live in Manhattan. My son lives in an apartment that's smaller than the closet in his childhood bedroom. My daughter has a washing machine that she found online that fits in their shower, and it's the greatest thing she's ever had. But she does not have a washing machine both upstairs and downstairs, the way people sometimes do. Today's refrigerators today are 70% more energy efficient than the refrigerators that were sold in the 1970s. But that doesn't mean that we use 70% less energy to refrigerate things, because in the first place, the first thing we did when we bought those new, more efficient refrigerators was move our old, inefficient refrigerators into the basement and keep them plugged in. And the second thing is that we developed a taste for refrigerated things. Refrigeration has made food production extraordinarily efficient, but Americans, I will say, I won't include Canadians in this, but residents of the United States currently throw away something like 40% of the edible food that they purchase. And when you throw away food, you're not only throwing away nutrients, you're also throwing away all the energy, the irrigation, the pesticides, the fertilizer, the transportation fuels, everything that went into producing it. The answer to that is not what some people have said, which is to eat only food grown locally, food grown nearby. In another one of the sort of disheartening paradoxes of environmentalism, the food food that comes from short distances away often has a huge carbon and energy footprint. My New Yorker colleague, Susan Orlean, has done something that is sort of inexplicably popular hobby currently, green hobby, which is raising your own chickens. She's written about it in the magazine. But Susan drives individual hens to the veterinarian. And that alone gives her eggs astronomical carbon footprint. There's a movie about Portland, Oregon that shows a mother and her young daughter driving to a local farm just beyond Portland's urban boundary in the ring of farmland that surrounds the city to buy local produce. And it's a 25-mile trip each way. She buys two grocery bags full of vegetables and drives them back, and felt very virtuous about herself, as I did not long ago when I went driving with a friend of mine who just bought a Ford Fusion, which is a hybrid automobile. The Fusion has on the odometer, it has a little gauge that fills with intertwined green foliage as you do things like avoiding jackrabbit starts and braking slowly and doing all the things that increase your fuel efficiency. And I have a college degree, and yet I felt sort of idiotically virtuous as we drove around as I thought about the environmental benefits that we were dispensing from the tailpipe. Toyota released a couple of television commercials when the Prius came out that showed a Prius driving across a colorless, lifeless landscape. As the Prius passes, though, the lifelessness bursts into bloom. These gray pods turn into children with flower petals around their faces, and there are other children with butterfly wings hovering above them, and music is playing in their rainbows and everything. And we deceive ourselves into thinking that by doing these things, essentially product substitution, we are vacuuming bad things from the world and making our problems go away. In fact, in many ways, we're making them worse by making ourselves believe that we that simply by changing the brand of automobile we drive, or by separating our trash into two separate piles, which is my favorite green activity, that we have made a substantial contribution to the future of the human race. In fact, the solutions, if there are solutions, are likely to be much more difficult, and we're not as good at doing those things as we are at product substitution. We're not as good at less as we are at more, and in many ways, what we need is to find ways to do less, to consume less, to consume less fossil fuel, to consume less water, to emit less carbon, to consume less, and that's a challenge. So I've run out of time. I was just about to explain how we're going to do that. So I spoke with some very intelligent graduate students today, and I have perfect confidence that they're going to figure it out. I know there is a physicist who is working on nuclear fusion, which is the great dream, the electricity that will be too cheap to meter when we figure out nuclear fusion. I know another physicist who's been working on solar power. The physicist who's working on solar power told me that he's putting all his hopes in nuclear fusion, and the physicist who's working on nuclear fusion said that he's putting all his hopes on solar. So those are two smart people, and so I hope they're both right. But anyway, thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are.